Good morning, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're getting an early start today with our reading of The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. This essay book was translated by Luigi Ricci. This is part 5. Hopefully you've read first 4 parts with Jimmy and enjoying them as we engage with Machiavelli and the study of power. Let's begin. Okay, let's begin here. Let's get this page certain. Here we go. Chapter 12. The different kinds of militia and mercenary soldiers. And remember who he's writing it to is Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Medici, right? He wants to tell Lorenzo what it means and how it means to be a prince. That's all Niccolo Machiavelli has to offer him is his study of mankind and power and so on and so forth. He doesn't have horses, riches to offer the prince. So he offers him his wisdom in the form of a book, an essay. So we're on chapter 12. He's been telling them about how you attain, retain, and then eventually lose power. Offering advice again, like Caesar Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, etc. Okay, chapter 12. How different kinds of militia and mercenary soldiers. Having now discussed fully the qualities of these principalities, if you remember, he was discussing ecclesiastical principalities and the different types of city-states, of which I propose to treat, and partially consider the causes of their prosperity or failure, and having also shown the methods by which many have sought to obtain such states, it now remains for me to treat generally of the methods, both offensive and defensive, that can be used in each of them. That's a long sentence, isn't it? But that's the way they wrote in those days, isn't it? Especially when you realize that Ricci has a lot to do with translating the Italian from Machiavelli, but he does a great job, which is why we chose his translations over other translations. Not that other translations aren't pretty good, but we like Luigi Ricci. So now he's going to talk about methods that can be used in taking principalities. We have said already how necessary it is for a prince to have his foundation for good. Otherwise, he is certain to be ruined. So he's got to build a good foundation. And that's true of anything. Building, if you don't have a good foundation for your building, it will collapse. If you don't have a good foundation of your stock investments, they will collapse. So foundations are important, according to Machiavelli, right? And he talks when he does write like this and talk to Lorenzo, he really says it in a very neutral, calm way. He talks about cruelty in a calm way. You know, some of you have been revolted when he talked about how Caesar Borgia, put out a magistrate and cut him in half and put him in the square. And that's a cruel thing for sure. But the way Machiavelli treats it for Lorenzo, he's just telling him as a matter of fact that if you're going to retain power, sometimes you have to be cruel. The chief foundations of all states, whether new or old or mixed, remember he talked about new or old or mixed, are good laws and good arms. Remember, good laws and good arms. And as there cannot be good laws where there are not good arms, and where there are good arms, there must be good laws. I will not discuss the laws, but I will speak of the arms. Jimmy put a little arrow there. Very important. There cannot be good laws where there are not good arms. You need arms to enforce the laws. Do you understand? I say, therefore, that the arms by which a prince defends his possessions are either his own or mercenaries. So he's talking about the kinds of arms, or auxiliaries, or mixed. Your own, mercenaries, auxiliaries, or a mixture. Got it? 4 kinds. The mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous. And if anyone supports his state by the arms of mercenaries, he will never stand firm or sure, as they are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, faithless, bold amongst friends, cowardly amongst enemies, and they have no fear of God, and they keep no faith with men. What does he really think? So if you use mercenaries, which means you pay people off. Now, if you remember, the British in the American Revolution used mercenaries, right? Didn't they? Remember that? Read up on the American Revolution or warfare. So he's basically saying when you use mercenaries or auxiliaries, what's an auxiliary? We're going to find out. So if you use those to support his state, the prince uses it to support, you're never going to stand firm or sure. You're always going to be on, shaky ground, right? Because why? Because mercenaries and auxiliaries are ambitious, disunited, etc., etc. Ruin is only deferred. Your ruin, Mr. Prince, Mr. Lorenzo, as long as the assault is postponed. Once you're assaulted, you're done. In peace, you are despoiled by them. And in war, you're despoiled by the enemy. So the cause of this is that they have no love or other motive to keep them in the field beyond a trifling wage, which is not enough to make them ready to die for you. You understand? Ready to die for you is one of the keys. Jimmy should mark that. Right? You can't pay people for loyalty. You can't buy loyalty. They are quite willing to be your soldiers so long as you do not make war. But when war comes, it is either fly or decamp altogether. I ought to have little trouble in proving this, since the ruin of Italy is now caused by nothing else but through her having relied for many years on mercenary arms. These did indeed help certain individuals to power, and they appeared courageous when matched against each other. But when the foreigner came, they showed their worthlessness. The foreigner, France, right? King of France. Thus it came about that the King Charles of France was allowed to take Italy without the slightest trouble. And those who said that it was owing to our sins spoke the truth, but it was not the sins that they meant, but those that I have just related. In other words, having mercenaries. So some people, when you lose something, oh, it's God's will. Well, according to Niccolo Machiavelli, it's not. It's because you use mercenaries. And as it was the sins of princes, they too have suffered the punishment. In other words, they're not princes anymore. I will explain more fully the defects of these arms. Defects. Mercenary captains are either very capable men or they're not. That's true of anybody, right? You're either very capable or you're not. See how matter of fact Machiavelli writes? If they are capable, you, Prince, cannot rely upon them, for they will always aspire to their own greatness, either by opposing you, their master, or by oppressing others against your intentions. But if the captain is not an able man, he's going to generally ruin you. So you're screwed either way, right? And if it is replied to this that whoever has armed forces will do the same, whether they're, so he kind of argues with himself, like Socratic method. But if you say that, well, whoever has armed forces will do the same, whether mercenary or not, I would reply that as armies are to be used either by a prince or by a republic, the prince must go in person to take the position of captain, and the republic must send its own citizen. If a man sent turns out incompetent, it must change him, the prince. And if capable, keep him by law from going beyond proper limits. So if you appoint somebody, right, and he's not capable, replace him. That's pretty good advice. And if he is capable, keep him under wraps with the law. And put a little arrow there, right? All right. And it is seen by experience that only princes and armed republics make very great progress. America's a republic, right? And they're armed. Only princes and armed republics make very great progress. Do you think our founding fathers read this? I think so. Whereas mercenary forces do nothing but harm. And also, look at his double arrow. An armed republic submits less easily to the rule of one of its citizens than a republic armed with foreign forces. Now you know why, right? The Second Amendment is there. Isn't this interesting? Here's an example, e.g., Jimmy gives you e.g. example. Rome and Sparta were for many centuries well armed and free. And the Swiss are well armed and they enjoy great freedom. As an example of mercenary armors in antiquity, there are the Carthaginians, who were opposed by their mercenary soldiers. After the termination of the First War with the Romans, Punic Wars, even while they still had their own citizens as captains. Philip of Macedon was made captain of their forces by the Thebans after the death of Epidaios, and as after gaining the victory, he deprived them of liberty. These are all examples he's giving you of how mercenaries screw things up. The Milanese, on the death of Duke Philip, they hired Francesco Sforza, you remember him, against the Venetians, who, having overcome the enemy at Caravaggio, allied himself with them to oppress the Milanese, his own employers. Half Gun Will Travel used to be a great Western series of Paladin. He would hire out his gun. He was a hired gun. Probably the only good mercenary that I ever watched on television. The father of this Sforza, being a soldier in the service of Queen Giovanna of Naples, left her suddenly unarmed, by which she was compelled, in order not to lose her kingdom, to throw herself into the arms of the King of Aragon. And if the Venetians and Florentines have in times past increased their domains by means of such forces, and their captains have not made themselves princes but have defended them, I reply that the Florentines in this case have been favored by chance. Fortune, right? Chance. For of the capable leaders whom they might have feared, some did not conquer, and some met with oppositions, and others directed their ambition elsewhere. The one who did not conquer was Sir John Hawkwood, whose fidelity could not be known as he was not victorious. But everyone will admit that he had conquered. The Florentines would have been at his mercy. Had he conquered, the Florentines would have been at his mercy. He knows his history. We're reading this and saying, what the heck is he talking about? Well, if you read it slower than Jimmy just read it and go back, he's giving examples of mercenaries, right, who screwed up and really hurt the prince. Remember, he's writing this to Lorenzo. Sforza had always the bracci against him, which served as a mutual check. Francesco directed his ambition. Francesco Sforza. He goes back and forth between first name, last name, towards Lombardy. Braccio against the church and the kingdom of Naples. But let us look at what occurred a short time ago. And remember, he's writing to Lorenzo. The Florentines appointed Paolo Vitelli, their captain, a man of great prudence who had risen from a private station to the highest reputation. If he had taken Pisa, no one can deny that it was highly important for the Florentines to retain his friendship. because he had become the soldier of their enemies. They would have had no means of opposing him. And if they had retained him, they would have been obliged to obey him. As to the Venetians, if one considers the progress that the Venetians made, it will be seen that they acted surely and gloriously so long as they made war with their own forces. Remember, that's his point of view. You need your own armies. You don't want to use mercenaries. That it was before they commenced their enterprises on land that they fought courageously with their own gentlemen and armed populace. But when they began to fight on land, they abandoned this virtue and they began to follow the Italian custom. And at the commencement of their land conquests, they had not much to fear from their captains, their territories not being very large, and their reputation being great. But as their possessions increased, as they did under Carmagnola, that they had an example of their mistake. For seeing that he was very powerful after he had defeated the Duke of Milan, and knowing, on the other hand, that he was but lukewarm in this war, they considered that they would not make any more conquests with him. He's talking about, right, all this time, the Venetians. And as they would not, then they could not dismiss him for fear of losing what they had already gained. In order to make sure of him, they were therefore obliged to execute him. Oh my gosh. They then had for captains Bartolomeo di Burano, Roberto di San Severino, and the Count di Petigliano, and such like from whom they had to fear loss instead of gain, as happened subsequently at Viala, where in one day they lost what they had laboriously gained in 800 years. For with these forces only slow and trifling acquisitions are made, but sudden and miraculous losses with these forces, mercenary forces. So with mercenaries, you can lose everything you did, you gained in a moment, right? Over the years. Kind of reminds you of the stock market. And as I have cited these examples from Italy, which has now for many years been governed by mercenary forces, I will now deal more largely with them, so that having seen their origin and progress, they can be better remedied. You must understand. Who's you? Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, right? You, O Prince, must understand that in these latter times, as soon as the empire began to be repudiated in Italy, and the Pope to gain a greater reputation in temporal matters. Remember, he was talking about the Pope Alexander and how he was in spiritual matters, he was like divine and all that, but as he gained more and more power with his army, Italy was divided into many states. Many of the principal cities took up arms against their nobles, who, favored by the emperor, had held them in subjugation. And the church encouraged this in order to increase its temporal power. Jimmy wrote a note here, and now we know. All of the stuff we've been reading in the first 4 parts, now he's going to explain it more. And don't forget, he already knows that Lorenzo knows. You understand? This is very important. Lorenzo already knows a lot of this because he's talking about current times. He's just reminding you, the prince, of what's going on. In many other cities, one of the inhabitants became the prince. He talked about how you make a citizen a prince. Thus, Italy, having fallen almost entirely into the hands of the church and a few republics, and the priests and other citizens not being accustomed to bear arms, they began to hire foreigners as soldiers. The first to bring into reputation this kind of militia was Albergo da Como, a native of Romana. Braccio and Sforza, who were in their day the arbiters of Italy, were, amongst others, trained by Como. After these came all of those others who up to the present day have commanded the armies of Italy. And the result of their prowess has been that Italy has been overrun by Charles, the French, preyed on by Louis, French, tyrannized over by Fernando, the Spanish guy, and insulted by the Swiss. Because Italy being mercenary and turmoil and fighting among themselves, they were easily overrun. You see what he's saying? The system adopted by them was in the first place to increase their own reputation by discrediting the infantry. They did this because they had no country and they lived on their earnings. A few foot soldiers did not augment their reputation and they could not maintain a large number, and therefore they restricted themselves almost entirely to cavalry, by which, with a smaller number, they were well paid and honored. He's talking about the stinginess, the greediness, the self-servingness of a mercenary. And they reduced things to such a state that in an army of 20,000 soldiers, there were not 2,000 foot soldiers. They had also used every means to spare themselves and the soldiers any hardship or fear by not killing each other in their encounters, but taking prisoners without expectation of ransom. They made no attacks on fortifications by night, and those in the fortifications did not attack the tents at night, and they made no stockades or ditches around their camps, and they did not take the field in winter. All of these things were permitted by their military code and adopted, and as we have said, to avoid trouble and danger, so that they have reduced Italy to slavery and degradation. In other words, they didn't know how to fight. Ladies and gentlemen, review your Roman Empire. Review how the Romans fought. Review how the Spartans fought. If you read Caesar's Gallic Wars, which is an interesting book, I wouldn't term it a classic, although maybe Caesar he wrote about his escapades, right, his wars. And one of the things that Rome did when they went to war is wherever they camped, they dug a moat around the camp. They built a fort and they put a moat around the camp. Why do they put moats around their camp? Well, to prevent the enemy from just coming up to the wall of the fort that they built. And if you saw Spartacus, you'll see one of the generals who went to fight Spartacus, the first general that got overrun, did not do that. He did not build a moat. So when Laurence Olivier, the general who eventually defeats Spartacus, asks him during the Senate review of what happened when they got slaughtered by Spartacus, he says, did you not fortify your encampment with moat and a wall? And he said, no, because they were just slaves. He didn't think much of the enemy. You understand? Chapter 13, you got to count, 10, 11, 12, 13. Roman numerals, ladies and gentlemen, of auxiliary mixed and native troops. When one asks a powerful neighbor to come to aid and defend one with his forces, they are termed auxiliaries. Here's your definition. You got a powerful neighbor and you say, come on over and help me. And they are as useless as mercenaries. So he's telling Lorenzo, don't do it. They're useless. This was done in recent times by Julius, who, seeing the wretched failure of his mercenary forces in his Ferrara enterprises, had recourse to auxiliaries. And so he arranged with Fernando, the king of Spain, that he should help him. He went to the king of Spain. Come on, help me. And these forces may be good in themselves, but they are always dangerous for those who borrow them. For if they lose, you are defeated. And if they conquer, you're going to remain their prisoner. Pay attention. I should have marked that. Why didn't Jimmy mark that? Come on. There we go. And although ancient history is full of examples of this, I will not depart from the example of Pope Julius II, which is still fresh. Nothing could be less prudent than the course that he adopted. For wishing to take Ferrara, he put himself entirely into the power of a foreigner. That's Spain, right? But by good fortune, there arose a third cause which prevented him reaping the effects of his bad policy. For when his auxiliaries were beaten at Ravenna, the Swiss rose up, and they drove back the victors against all expectation of himself or others, so that he was not taken prisoner by the enemy which had fled, nor by his own auxiliaries having conquered by other arms than theirs. The Florentines, being totally disarmed, they hired 10,000 Frenchmen to attack Pisa, by which measure they ran greater risk than any period of their struggles. The Emperor of Constantinople, to oppose his neighbors, put 10,000 Turks into Greece, who after the war wouldn't go away, which was the beginning of the servitude of Greece to the infidels. Machiavelli really understands what's going on, and he's trying to explain to Lorenzo it's better to rely on your own army. That's what the gist of all this is. And one, therefore, who wishes not to conquer would do well to use these forces, which are much more dangerous than mercenaries, as with them ruin is complete. For they are all united, and we owe obedience to others, the auxiliaries. Whereas with mercenaries, when they have conquered, it requires more time and good opportunity for them to injure you. So you're better off, if you got to choose the mercenaries, right? As they do not form a single body and have been engaged and paid by you. Therefore, a third party that you have made leader cannot at once acquire through authority to be able to injure you. Remember, he's always about protecting the prince. And in a word, the greatest danger with mercenaries lies in their cowardice and reluctance to fight. But with auxiliaries, the danger lies in their courage. It's very important. You see? You see how he defines that in helping Lorenzo? A wise prince, therefore, always avoids these forces and has recourse to his own, and would prefer rather to lose with his own men than to conquer with the forces of others, not deeming it a true victory which is gained by foreign arms. You understand? So he's telling Lorenzo, it's better to lose with your own people. That's an interesting observation, isn't it? I never hesitate to cite the example of Caesar Borgia in his actions. This duke, Caesar Borgia, entered Romagna with auxiliary troops, leading forces composed entirely of French soldiers, and with these he took Imola and Forli. But as they seemed unsafe, he had recourse to mercenaries as a less likely risky policy. And so he hired the Orsini and Vitelli. Afterwards, finding these uncertain to handle, unfaithful and dangerous, he suppressed them, and then he relied on his own men. And the difference between these forces can easily be seen if one considers the difference between the reputation of the Duke, Caesar Borgia, when he had only the French, and when he had the Orsini and Vitelli, and when he had to rely on himself and his own soldiers. So Caesar Borgia used mercenaries, he used auxiliaries, and he used his own men. But he used them at a time when it's to his advantage. And his reputation will be found to have constantly increased. And he was never so highly esteemed as when everyone saw that he was the sole master of his forces. I do not wish to depart from recent Italian instances, but, example, I cannot omit Hiero of Syracuse. We read about him, right? Whom I have already mentioned. This man being, as I said, made head of the army by the Syracusans, immediately recognized the uselessness of that militia, which was organized like our Italian mercenary troops. And as he thought it unsafe either to retain them or dismiss them, he had them cut into pieces and thenceforward made war with his own arms and not those of others. This sounds really like, well, it's matter of fact, he just had them cut into pieces. Well, he's being very objective. Do you know what the objective and subjective are? Maybe we should take a moment. What does it mean to be objective? OBJC. And then subjective. Oops. Let's go back here. Objective and subjective. He had them cut in pieces. He had them cut in pieces. Objective. So how would you say that subjectively? Subjectively, he destroyed them. He hurt them. You start adjectiving. You start adding adjective. He was an unbelievable, cruel, right? You start putting adjectives and emotion into it. Objective is unemotional. It's unemotional. It's logical. Subjective is emotional. Subjective. It's your point of view. Throughout this whole thing, he's trying to be very objective to the prince. He's not saying one or the other. He's just making observations. The sun goes around the earth, right? That's what they used to believe in these days. The sun goes around the earth and it's going to... See, you can get subjectively, right? Subjective. So look at the way people write and what they say. Are they being objective or are they being subjective? And so therefore he made war with his own arms and not those of others. And I would also call to mind symbolic tale whom the Old Testament... Remember I told you to read the Bible, there's many allusions. Here's one, which well illustrates this point. When David offered to Saul to go and fight against the Philistine Goliath, Saul, to encourage him, armed him with his own arms, gave him his own armor, which when David had tried on, he refused, saying that with them that he could not fight so well with borrowed arms. This is very important. You don't fight well with borrowed arms, with someone else's weapons. He preferred, therefore, to face the enemy with his own sling and knife. In short, the arms of others either fail, overburden, or they else impede you. You understand? So you got to use your own wits, your own methods, you never fight. There's a movie with lions where Kirk Douglas Jr., goes out to fight, Michael Douglas goes out to fight the lions, those two lions who were eating. I forgot the name of the movie right now, but I'll remember it. But anyway, he uses, Val Kilmer is in there, and he borrows the doctor's shotgun, or the gun that he's going to use to kill the lions. And as he's pointing it at the lion, it misfires. And then so Michael Douglas takes him to task and said, you never go out with another man's weapon. Never. You never go hunting a beast that could kill you with another man's weapon without testing it. Charles VII, father of Louis XI, having through good fortune and bravery liberated France from the English and recognized this necessity of being armed with his own forces, established in his kingdom a system of men-at-arms and infantry. And afterward, King Louis, his son, abolished the infantry and began to hire Swiss, which mistake being followed by others is, as now may be seen, a cause of danger to his kingdom. For by giving the reputation to the Swiss, France had disheartened all her own troops, the infantry having been abolished, and the men-at-arms being obliged to foreigners for assistance. For being accustomed to fight with Swiss troops, they think that they cannot conquer without them. Whence it comes that the French are insufficiently strong to oppose the Swiss, and without the aid of the Swiss, they will not venture against others. So the armies of the French are thus of a mixed kind, partly mercenary, partly their own, and taken together they are much better than the troops entirely composed of mercenaries and auxiliaries, but they are much inferior to national forces. And let this example be sufficient, for the kingdom of France would be invincible if Charles' military organization had been developed or maintained. But, note the arrow, men with their lack of prudence initiate novelties, and finding the first taste good, they don't notice the poison within, as I pointed out previously in regard to wasting favors. Men, with their lack of prudence, initiate novelties. They call that in business the shiny new object. Corporations get involved in the shiny new object. And they find the first taste good. Oh, this is great. But they don't notice the poison within, and pointed out in previous regard to wasting fervors. The prince, therefore, who fails to recognize troubles in his state as they arise, is not truly wise, and is given to a few to be thus. And it is given to few to be like that. I used to work for one of my clients, was basically, he needed to know everything. And when people didn't tell him everything, he really got ticked off because he knew that he has to recognize trouble in his company as they arise. He couldn't wait to let it fester. He had to know immediately. It's kind of like control freak. They call that a control freak, right? But there's a certain, when you're defending your state, there's a certain way you got to have information. Information is power. If we consider the first cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire, we shall find it merely due to hiring Goth mercenaries. And from that time, we find the Roman strength begin to weaken. All the advantages derived from the empire fell to the Goths. Study your history. Study your history. That's what Machiavelli did. So I conclude by saying that no prince is secure without his troops. And on the contrary, he's entirely dependent on fortune. So if you don't have your own troops, you're dependent on fortune, having no trustworthy means in defense in time of trouble. It has always been held that proclaimed by wise men, quod nihil sit tam infernum, aut insatiable quam fama potentia non su vi nixe. There is nothing so weak or unstable as fame, powers not based on their own strength. There's your Latin. Plug that into Google, copy it, plug it into Google, and Google tells you what the Latin is. Even though I studied Latin, Jimmy studied Latin, it's been many, many years because when he studied it, it was the dead language. And now it's even deader. Is there such a word? One's own troops are those composed either of subjects or of citizens or of one's own dependents. All others are mercenaries and auxiliaries. The way to organize one's own troops is easily learned if the methods of the four princes mentioned above be studied. And if one considers how Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, and many republics and sovereigns have organized theirs. With such examples as these, there's no need to labor the point. So he's telling Lorenzo, go study the four people that he talked about before. Alexander the Great, etc. Chapter 14. The duties of a prince with regard to the militia. A prince should therefore have no other aim. This is very important. A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study, but war and its organization and discipline, for that is the only art that is necessary to one who commands. And it is of such virtue that it not only maintains those who are born princes, but often enables men of private fortune to attain that rank. And you're going to say, well, Jimmy, we live in America. This is a republic and many other, right? There's no such thing as a prince. Pardon me, I took a sip of coffee before I tell you the truth. Of course there's princes. What do you think a CEO of a corporation is? What do you think the president is? Well, he's just a president. He's elected official. Of course he is. But he rules with power. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a study of power. Power. I worked for a client once and said, Jimmy, why do you always use war analogies when you're talking to me and when you're explaining to me about the competition? Why do you always use, why do we use war in that? Why do you use that all the time? It's disgusting. I said, well, you may think so, but what do you want to do to the competition? You want to kill the competition. You want to eliminate the competition. You want to weaken the competition. Ladies and gentlemen, business, if you haven't figured this out yet, business is legalized warfare. Legalized warfare. You're trying to get rid of the competition. Through rules, through regulations, through guerrilla warfare. It's all about war. And he's telling Lorenzo, you should study. You shouldn't study anything except war. Because war with your troops is going to keep you the prince. If you don't have a strong army, you're not going to be the prince. Do you understand that? Can you understand that? As one sees, on the other hand, that when princes think more of luxury than of arms, they lose their state. You see this? This is a objective statement. When a prince thinks more of luxury than of arms, the chief cause of the loss of states is the contempt of this art, the art of war. And I don't think Sun Tzu, we're going to talk about Sun Tzu in a moment. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War. He was Chinese, right? It's a great, great book, The Art of War. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Machiavelli did not know Sun Tzu, but Machiavelli understood Sun Tzu because he studied war like Sun Tzu studied war. Got it? And the way to acquire them is to be well-versed in the same. And they say, well, Francesco Sforza, through being well-armed, became from private status, he became the Duke of Milan. And his sons, through wishing to avoid the fatigue and the hardship of war, from dukes became private persons. So he rose to be the duke, and then his sons went back to being private citizens because they didn't want to. They wanted to avoid the fatigue and the hardship of war. For among other evils caused by being disarmed, it renders you contemptible, which is one. And I guess we're going to stop there. Holy mackerel, we're done already. Wow. Oh my God, we're just getting into chapter 14, which will carry over in the next reading. You've been reading with Jimmy this morning. I hope you had a good morning. Learn more about Niccolo Machiavelli by watching our ongoing videos of The Prince. This was number 5. 678. Three more, and we've finished The Prince, ladies and gentlemen. Be sure and visit and read other classics with Jimmy on the website. If you have questions, please email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. I'm anxious to hear what you think about this because, objectively, I'm interested. Subjectively, well, you can send me the emails, but I probably won't respond to subjective. You're blah, 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 if you start complaining, right? He's talking in very clear terms about power. Power, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone should be interested in the study of power, which includes force. It's not all, let's just have a village. It's not like that. I wish it was, but it's not like that. It's just not, it'll never be like that. How do I know that? Read Machiavelli with me. He talks about, ladies and gentlemen, the nature of people. Technology changes, but the nature of people doesn't change. Does it? Does it? Oh, God, I can't wait for the analysis. Have a great day.